the Center for the Study of Contemporary China. And he is here to give the formal introduction to our speaker. Please, Jacques.
Thank you, Fred. And I'll put in a plug for people interested in contemporary China issues. You can go to the Center for the Study of Contemporary China website to see stuff we've got coming up. I won't take time to list that since it's a CAS show today. It's a great pleasure and a real honor for me to introduce this year's Distinguished East Asia Lecture by Professor Jerome A. Cohen, someone who truly needs no introduction, but is going to get one anyway. Jerry is the founder and faculty director emeritus of the U.S. Asia Law Institute at New York University School of Law, having nominally, and I emphasize nominally, retired after more than 3 decades on that faculty. Earlier in his academic career, Jerry was a professor at Harvard Law School, where he truly pioneered the teaching of Chinese law and Asian law in the United States, and was the founding director of the East Asian Legal Studies program at Harvard, which along with the NYU Institute remains one of the premier centers for the study of Asian law pretty much anywhere in the world. Before Harvard, he taught at Berkeley after clerking for not 1, but 2 Supreme Court justices. But he got the China bug after that rather conventional start and went on to the career that we all know him so well for. He's been a prolific scholar, producing some of the seminal work in the field, including The Criminal Process in the People's Republic of China, 1949 to 63. Which was an extraordinary collection of primary documents and analyses drawing on refugee interviews in Hong Kong back in the days when Americans couldn't get into China, and it's still the definitive work on the topic. He's also the author of People's China and International Law, a magisterial 2-volume set that is foundational in its field and also brings together primary documents and erudite commentary. Jerry's been a generous co-author as well as a prolific solo author. The books I just mentioned on international law were done with the late Chiu Hongda. And just a few years ago, he partnered with a much younger scholar, Maggie Lewis, an NYU alum as well, to write Challenge to China, How Taiwan Abolished Its Version of Re-Education Through Labor. He's also finally the co-author of China Today and Her Ancient Treasures with one Joan LeBold Cohen, Jerry's wife and longtime partner in many types of crime. She is a noted authority on contemporary Chinese art as well as a truly brilliant photographer and historian. In his academic career, Jerry has written more articles than I can count, book chapters, op-eds, blog posts, and so on a rich variety of topics on law and related subjects in China, Hong Kong, Taiwan, elsewhere in East Asia, and beyond. Of particular note, especially in recent years, has been his work on human rights, international law as it relates to China, Hong Kong, and Taiwan, criminal justice reform in that part of the world, and judicial institutions. Jerry's done a lot more than write. He has been equally and extraordinarily productive as a teacher. He truly is the dean of Chinese legal studies in the United States and of Asian legal studies more generally. He's been involved in pretty much everything from the beginning of the field down to the present in the United States. I'm going to put in one small pen footnote dig here. As we were talking just before we went with the formal part of our session here, the GOAT, which many of you know from the lobby of the Penn Law School here, was a gift by Clarence Morris and Derek Boddy, who teamed up to do one of the very early courses on Chinese law in the US. And I know Jerry is an old friend and colleague of theirs, come by and visit the GOAT anytime. More to the point, nearly every professor or scholar of Chinese law in the US or many places around the world is a student of Jerry's, or a student of a student of Jerry's, or a student of a student of a student of Jerry's, and on down through what I think is about 5 or 6 generations now, more than the PRC has had generations of leaders. And basically any gathering in the field is essentially the Jerry Cohen Alumni Club or some chapter of it. His influence really extends throughout the region. His former dean, John Sexton, who I think we can all agree does not have the world's smallest ego, was humbled by Jerry being far more recognized throughout the world than John was, leading John supposedly to carry Jerry's bags in a gesture of understanding who was really running the show here. Many accomplished academics, including Jerry, have held chairs. Jerry is unusual in that he actually has a chair named after him, or at least partly so. The Jerome A. and Joan LeBold Cohen Chair in East Asian Legal Studies at Harvard, now occupied by, of course, one of Jerry's former students, Bill Alford. That's just the academic part. Not to burn too much time here, I'll say a little bit about Jerry's non-academic career. He's been deeply engaged in the policy and advocacy world as well, through his blogs and op-eds. His advice to policymakers, which I think goes back to when his then obscure Harvard colleague Henry Kissinger was about to go off and work with Nixon on the opening to China, through his work in the Tiananmen incident back in June 4th, 1989, when I had the privilege of as a fairly young person in the field at that time, working with Jerry and a bunch of very able lawyers to do a kind of as it happened review of the human rights issues arising from that incident. Through a fascinating role he played in later Korean President Kim Dae-jung's surviving a rather dire set of challenges and persecutions during the authoritarian days in Korea, to shaping the worldview of many people who've gone on to make policy, including Taiwan's most recent former president, Ma Ying-jeou, who was a student of Jerry's back when. In the policy world, he also served for several years as a CV Star Senior Fellow and Director of Asia Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations, where he remains an Adjunct Senior Fellow for Asia Studies and brings some truly extraordinary speakers through his series there. And if that's not enough for several lifetimes, Jerry was also a field-shaping practitioner of law. He left academia to become one of the first foreign lawyers into China when the era of reform and opening began, representing many companies and individuals in contract negotiations, joint ventures, dispute resolution, and China-related cases, and so on. For most of his 20 or so years in practice, he was a partner at Paul Weiss, Rifkin, Wharton, and Garrison in New York and in China. And by the way, if you spend even a few months at Paul Weiss, as I did once many years ago, you will hear many a tale about just how wonderful Jerry is, praised for his brilliance, his wisdom, and his kindness. Those are characteristics that I have been privileged to enjoy for many years now, along with his generous guidance, his incisive comments on one's work, and invaluable mentorship and support, and the ever so often killer anecdote, including, I hope you'll tell the one about showing up as a black and white cat pair with a reference to Mao and Deng at a Halloween party in Beijing back in the old days. I could go on to say a lot more, but I trust that what I said is already more than enough to make clear that Jerry has seen and done it all when it comes to law and broadly related matters in China and elsewhere in the region. I will just say that we have been working on bringing Jerry here as the Distinguished East Asia Lecturer since a long time ago, back when I was Fred's predecessor as director of the center, and I'm delighted it finally has come to pass. I wish it could be on site rather than virtual. So I'd ask everyone to please join me in welcoming Professor Jerome Cohen to deliver this year's CEAS Distinguished East Asia Lecture on a lifetime of adventures in East Asia. Jerry?
Well, Jacques, after that comprehensive introduction, I'm tempted just to say to people, any questions? Everything you said brings to mind something that I could say. And psychic income is not taxable. So I welcome your remarks, even though they take up 10 minutes of the time I've allotted for my presentation. I remember introducing John Fairbank in the year he retired at a lecture in the Asia Society. And John was very sensitive about retirement, which then required you to retire at 65. And in front of several hundred people, I started to introduce him by saying, Professor Fairbank is the Dean of Chinese Studies. And he interrupted me. And he said, is this necessary? And I finished my sentence and I sat down. Well, that night he tried to reach me. I was still in New York. He'd come back and he reached my secretary, who used to be his secretary, and he spent all his time apologizing to her as he did the next day. But I'm going to make a couple of apologies in the next few minutes, but they won't relate to the introduction. And I usually say, I hope my obituary will be as kind as your introduction. You're right in recalling my early visits to Penn. I came down to Penn in 1965 at the invitation of the great sinologist Dirk Bade. And he and a very able senior law professor at Penn named Clarence Morris were experimenting with a seminar on the Chinese legal system. And they asked me to come down. They had compiled a very impressive list of Chinese Qing dynasty, Manchu dynasty law cases, which they got translated into English. And I liked their materials. And that ended up being the first book in the Harvard University Press series on East Asian law, law in imperial China. And I was impressed also with that wonderful sculpture, the Shejai that Jacques mentioned. It's in the lobby of the law school. And I was impressed by the people I'd met, including two students of Dirk Botta named Alan and Adele Rickett. They had been graduate students in Chinese studies. They went to China in the last years of Chiang Kai-shek's regime as the Civil War was coming to a close. And they stayed on, a fateful decision. And in 1951, during the first mass movement to repress counter-revolution, so-called, both husband and wife were locked up. And they were locked up she for 4 years, he for 4.5 years. And it wasn't togetherness, however. They were locked up separately with large numbers of, he was with at least a dozen Chinese colleagues, and she with a similar number of women. And they produced a very interesting book some of you have read called Prisoners of Liberation, a kind of his and hers account of how they got locked up and what detention in China meant. And I liked Alan so much, I invited him up a couple of times to talk to my students at Harvard. And anything I tell you about my so-called adventures in East Asia pales in comparison with the adventures you could read about in Prisoners of Liberation. Well, like a good East Asian, let me begin with at least one apology. Why did I pick such a historical subject instead of exciting contemporary subjects as important and recent as today's news, whether we talk about Hong Kong, or we talk about the South China Sea or the East China Sea, or we talk about the repression of the Muslim minorities in Xinjiang, or we talk about the Tibetans or the crisis that's emerging once again in the Taiwan Strait. We've got all these wonderful contemporary issues. And why do I choose to rake up the past, if only to amuse you and to get to work on my own memoirs? And it reminds me in 1954, I was the head of the Yale Law Journal, a third-year student. I had to invite a speaker, and I much admired Dean Acheson. Probably that's why I have a mustache. In any event, I invited him and he agreed to come. I was quite excited. And then he said, "What would you like me to talk about?" And I said, "Joe McCarthy, that's what we're all worried about. Or Brown against Board of Education, the desegregation decision that had just been handed down. Or the Marshall Plan. Acheson had been instrumental in establishing the Marshall Plan for Western Europe." And he wrote back a letter and he said, "I want to talk about Washington and the Supreme Court from 1919 to 1921. And I was crestfallen. And I went in and I talked to Dean Harry Shulman, who knew Acheson well, and he laughed. He said, "Let Dean talk about whatever he wants, and you'll find it worthwhile." Well, I hope you'll find worthwhile my own observations about the past. But a second apology is about the title. When I prepared some notes for today, I saw a lifetime of adventures in East Asia. And like a decent lawyer, I immediately thought, are these really adventures? Maybe I used the wrong word. I'll leave that to you to decide. And then adventures in East Asia. Well, some of the adventures inevitably took part in the United States, as well as in East Asia. But we can pick that one apart when I get done with my recitation. maybe the first adventure I should tell you is really shows from what a low posture one can start a life. I started studying Chinese August 15th, 1960 at 9 a.m. By the spring of 61, I still didn't know much at all. And I didn't write anything at that point about China and law. But I was happily learning my characters and preparing to do some teaching the following year when a letter arrived from Hong Kong University inviting me to be a speaker at the program honoring the 50th anniversary of Hong Kong University. And I just was so puzzled. Why in the world? How do they even know about me? And they invited my wife, Joan. Well, this was irresistible. And so we hadn't even been to Asia yet. We decided we had to accept that. And we left a couple of college girls we had confidence in charge of our 3 young children. And off we went to Japan and Taiwan, each time, each visit very, very interesting. And then we got to Hong Kong. And the program opened with a dinner the night before. And when I got to the dinner, the mystery was solved because people came up to me and started to thank me and congratulate me on the books that I had published on the economy of China and Japan. And of course, I hadn't published anything relevant. And we discovered that they meant to invite Jerome B. Cohen. I'm Jerome A. Cohen. Now, when you start your career at that point, you've got nowhere to go but up. And I hoped that 50 years later, they might invite me to the 100th anniversary of Hong Kong University. And that by that time, I might have done something to earn the invitation. And after 47 years, I gave a talk at Hong Kong University one day, and I told the students this story. And of course, they loved it. And I said, I hope I am invited to the 100th anniversary 3 years from now, but I'm not betting on it because by then it was clear Beijing was calling the shots in Hong Kong, and I was not on their favored list. Well, was that an adventure? It certainly was a chastening experience. Hong Kong was actually the site of a more useful, you might say, experience because Joan and I went back to live there in 1963, 64. Having been a federal prosecutor, I was interested in criminal justice in China. I didn't have many other subjects I felt qualified to invest in the comparative law fashion. The problem was the absence of published materials. The Chinese government for the first 30 years, 49 to 79, as some of you know so well, really didn't have much formal law to show. And we had to scrounge for sources. And I decided with the encouragement of my great colleague at Berkeley, the sociologist Franz Schermann, I better interview refugees from China if I could find relevant ones in Hong Kong. And I spent a year there meeting people in 3 categories: ordinary people to find out what they thought about law, people who had been targets, victims of the system, prosecuted and convicted, etc. And then a very slim category, those who were operators of the system, administrators, policemen, prosecutors, judges. Those were the most difficult to find. And I had a wonderful year there and I learned a lot. And I did have a few adventures in the sense of how to find these people. And I remember in November of 63, Joan and I took the ferry down to Macau and spent some time trying to find refugees who were then pretty fresh out of the water, having swum from China. And some of them, desperate for money, tried to convince me that they were relevant specialists in the legal system. But of course, They weren't. But I did get one fellow who said to me, if you don't believe me, when you get to Hong Kong, you can call up the editor of the Tiantian Herbao, the daily news there. And I called up the editor. He said he'd never heard of this refugee I was interviewing, but he said, if you really want to meet somebody who knows about the legal system, I've got a guy working for me who started in Singapore, went to the mainland for legal education, became a judge and then a lawyer, and finally had to leave China after the anti-rightist movement of 1957-58. And that led me to my most prized informant. And after 85 hours, I hired the guy to be my assistant, and he helped me later in many respects. I interviewed one public security person from Fujian province for 120 hours. And although his Mandarin was not perfectly spoken, every fu was who and every who was woo. And it didn't do much for my spoken accent in Mandarin, but I certainly learned a lot about how the police could operate. And I remember one day I asked him, I was trying to figure out what is a crime in China? What's the borderline between crime and non-crime? And adultery was the real question. Did they punish adultery? And I remember asking him, he didn't realize how funny he was. He said, if we started to punish adultery, he said, we wouldn't have any time for the counter-revolutionaries. And of course, as a former prosecutor, I understood what he meant. Resources are limited. You have to have priorities and use discretion. Well, I learned a lot from that year in Hong Kong. Maybe the most important thing I did was I helped to set up the University Service Center. And I actually ran it for most of the year because the fellow originally sent out by the Carnegie Foundation in New York was not very energetic and was so afraid of offending British intelligence people who were sure we were all CIA agents. If you're a professor, why aren't you professing instead of coming out here and pretending when you're really trying to spy on Hong Kong, on China from Hong Kong? And you see, that's not a new problem, as they suspect many of us today, going out to Hong Kong and supposedly trying to spy on China from there. That's a problem we can revert to. The University Service Center is about 53 years old now and is now part of the Chinese University of Hong Kong. And I hope it will survive the current attack on academe and civil liberties in Hong Kong. Well, what else can I say? Maybe I shouldn't say any more about Hong Kong, except later we returned to live there. 1979, early January, and we lived there in and out, commuting to China for 2.5 years. And Hong Kong at that time was a wonderful place for exotic action. It was in Hong Kong that I was in touch with Senator Aquino's sister, who was a journalist there. He was in jail under the Marcos regime. We wanted to get him out, and they made an arrangement behind the scenes with Marcos that if he could get into Harvard for some visiting scholarship position, Marcos would free him. And this took some behind the door negotiation, and over the phone, I was referred to as Jesus Christ because my initials are JC. And we eventually got Aquino to Harvard, and he did a wonderful job. And Mrs. Aquino is the only future president ever to cook me and my son Ethan dinner. It was wonderful, except Aquino refused to listen to advice that he should not return to the Philippines when his first year ended. and you know about the tragic assassination. Hong Kong was also a good place for jumping off to Taiwan. And it was in Hong Kong in 1984, after the assassination of the Chinese American writer Henry Liu in San Francisco, October 15th, that I was asked by a former student representing his widow in San Francisco, could we do anything to get the Chiang Kai-shek's son's government of Taiwan to compensate for the assassination, because they had really put up the leading gangsters, the Bamboo Union Gang in Taiwan, to go to San Francisco and to assassinate Henry Liu. And I spent a lot of time going back and forth from Hong Kong to Taiwan. And toward the end of this talk, I'll describe that great incident, because that was the time, the only time you could say my life was in danger, because the gang might have rubbed me out, or the intelligence people of the KMT who were experts on secret assassination. The other use of Hong Kong at the time really developed in 1989 and the 90s, and it was a jumping off point to learn about Vietnam. And I made over 30 trips from Hong Kong to Vietnam. I think the total 40 something eventually. Even though initially you had to go via Bangkok and stay overnight and get your visa, eventually you could have direct flights to Ho Chi Minh City and to Hanoi. And Hong Kong became a kind of staging area for those who wanted to apply in Vietnam what they had learned about investing in China. And that had come to a temporary halt in China after the tragedy of June 4th, 1989. Well, so much for Hong Kong. I want to say quite a lot about Taiwan. I first went to Taiwan in '61. I became very much involved, as most visitors from democratic liberal countries were, in the suppression of the Taiwan people by the Chiang Kai-shek dictatorship, which seemed to be a new and worse colonial power than the Japanese had been in their 50-year occupation of Taiwan from 1895 to 1945. In those years, Chiang Kai-shek's son, Jiang Jingguo, head of the secret police, was a notorious killer. And that's to be remembered when in the mid-'80s, he showed he had developed in a very different way, and a way that helped to play a crucial role in the freedom that Taiwan has come to enjoy. In the late 60s, I became interested, or really the mid 60s, I guess, in the fate of the Taiwan University law professor. National Taiwan University at that time was dominated by mainland scholars. There were one or two so-called kept Taiwanese on the faculty. And this fellow named Peng Ming Min, was a specialist in public international law, especially air law. And he got an award as one of the outstanding young scholars in Taiwan. But then they discovered, after he put out a democratic manifesto in 1964, that he was really a Taiwan independence person. And they prosecuted him and sentenced him to 8 years in prison. I was relatively new to the game, but I was enlisted in the cause of protesting his repression. And foreign pressure worked. Kuomintang was sensitive to US pressure. And in '65, they commuted his sentence to house arrest. So he was in prison, but under house arrest. And I knew that on the next trip to Taiwan, I wanted to see him. In 1969, the American Council of Learned Societies and the Social Science and Research Council established a three-person delegation to go to Taiwan, because Taiwan policy, and it was very important to the American government and people. And they asked historian Martin Wilbur from Columbia and a political scientist, the Englishman George Taylor, who was very pro Chiang Kai-shek, and me to go out there representing history, political science, and law. And I decided, well, if I'm going out there, I want to meet Peng Ming-min. And I called up, and Fox Butterfield, who had been a graduate student at Harvard in history, had become a stringer for the New York Times in Taiwan. And I asked Fox, could he arrange for me to meet Peng Ming-min despite house arrest? Next thing I knew, when I went to get a visa in New York, I was denied a visa. That was shocking. I was going out for an academic exchange, but of course they had heard over the phone that I wanted to meet Peng Ming-min, and that was not to happen from the view of the Diaochaju, the investigation branch of the Kuomintang government. I came back to Harvard the next day and I told my graduate students that I'd been denied a visa to Taipei. And one of them, a fellow named, let's see, his name, Xiao, let's see, Tao Shisheng. Tao Shisheng was the father, Tao Longsheng was the son. And he was studying criminal law with me, and he was shocked. And without saying anything, he called up his father, Tao Shisheng, who was a famous writer, philosopher, political scientist, who was one of the key advisors to Chiang Kai-shek. Without my knowledge, Tao Shisheng went in and told the Generalissimo this story, and Chiang Kai-shek reportedly said, "Let him in. I hear he's open-minded. Maybe we can win him over." So next thing I knew, I did get my visa. And although when I got to the airport in Taiwan, my great student, Zhang Wei-ren, who's still writing important tomes on Chinese legal history in Taiwan, he met me at the airport and he said, "Mr. Tao Shisheng asks you, don't meet Peng Ming-min because that might embarrass him." But Fox Butterfield assured us that we could meet Peng Ming-min without knowledge of the government. And through some cloak and dagger, taking one taxi into a hotel, going out the side door of the hotel into another taxi, we were whisked out to the suburbs, to Yangmingshan, to the home of a wonderful missionary couple named Thornberry. And there, with shades drawn, was Peng Ming-min. And we had a very delightful dinner, but we had to get back. And Mrs. Thornberry was going to drive us back. I sat in the front seat with her, and Joan was in the back with Peng Ming-min and Fox Butterfield. And we're driving by, and to get by from their house to Taipei, you had to go by the presidential summer palace at Yangmingshan. And there was a guard in front with a bayonet on his rifle, and he saw us in the distance and he shouted, "Halt!" And without asking us, Mrs. Thornberry simply swerved the car and drove down a side road. And that fellow could have shot us. And it was a very tense moment. Well, we got back to our hotel, the Grand Hotel, and there in front of our room, the Grand Hotel, by the way, was owned by Madame Chiang Kai-shek. And I always stayed there because I thought it was unlikely they'd do anything to me there in her own hotel. And there in front of our room is this man with a Chinese newspaper sitting in a chair right in front of our door. And he was holding the newspaper upside down. And it was obvious he was just a spy there waiting for us, another intimidating factor. Well, that was an exciting moment, so exciting that Joan said, "I'm never coming back here until Taiwan is free." It was just too nerve-wracking. And it took 25 years till she made her next trip back in the mid-90s to find that Taiwan, of course, had become a different place. Well, that was a good start for events. I had similar occurrences in South Korea under the Park dictatorship. Before getting on to that, I better say a word about Japan and our first visit to China and maybe getting to North Korea. In 1971, I had a Guggenheim to go to Japan for a year. I was going to be a visiting professor at Doshisha University in Kyoto at their law school. Doshisha was a very nice university, private, 20,000 students. And I was assigned a very nice office, except when I got there, I couldn't go to the office. In fact, I could only use the university tennis courts for the first month because this university of 20,000 students was shut down by 80 students and others who were called the Sekigun, the Red Army. And Japan was plagued by these undemocratic groups, shall we say, that were often violent. And these fellas wore helmets and they had bandanas around their face and they had big bamboo clubs and they intimidated the whole university. The president retreated to the hospital to hide out for a few weeks. Professors couldn't teach. And it was something to behold. We often think that universities are sheltered islands in dictatorial countries sometimes. But in this case, university was a dictatorial island in a democratic country. And that created a lot of tension, but I learned a lot from that. The most outstanding thing that happened in Japan was I had a friend at the Asahi newspaper, this reporter had visited Harvard. He'd wanted to meet Ambassador Reischauer, our distinguished professor of Japanese studies, who'd been ambassador to Japan for 5 years. He was having difficulty getting through, and I arranged for Reischauer to see him. And this reporter was very nice. He said, when you come to Japan, look me up. And I did. And he said, what can I do for you? I said, you can't do anything for me. You're a journalist in Japan. What can you do? He said, I've got a new assignment. And my assignment is to cover the North Koreans in Japan, especially the North Korean big diplomatic mission in Tokyo. He said, you want to meet them? I said, of course I want to meet them. I'd become interested in Korea policy for quite a number of years. It's part of our East Asian subject matter. I'd had many Korean students at Harvard Law School. I'd been there. I said, I want to meet them. And on Thanksgiving Day of 1971, while Joan and the 3 boys were waiting for me at a Chinese restaurant to celebrate Thanksgiving dinner, I had to first go meet the North Koreans at their big embassy-like structure. And it went very well, but rather general. And I remember distinctly, they gave me 3 dozen red roses. And no one had ever given me red roses before. And I had to walk around Tokyo for an hour until I could catch up with the family. And you know, when you're in Japan and you're carrying 3 dozen roses, women look at you differently. They think, what a romantic figure. And they had no idea that the romance would be shattered if they knew the roses came from the North Koreans. But that began a long courtship. And it became clear that these people thought that maybe it would be nice if I visited North Korea. They knew I had played a role in the establishment of diplomatic relations between the US and China. They were stunned by the Kissinger secret trip, which I had recommended as chair of the Harvard Committee of 67, 68. That was preparing recommendations for a new China policy. And they thought maybe something could happen if I got a chance to go to North Korea. And it was a very complex negotiation, but over 6 months where they wined us and dined us, North Korean leaders in Japan live like capitalists. Big limousine, they played golf on Saturday. They had wonderful lobsters follow their Kobe beef dinner. And they really put it on. I thought it was a little nauseating because we knew people were dying of starvation in North Korea. But we made a deal to go, and the Asahi reporter had asked me, if the North Koreans get you to go to their country, give me a one-day scoop. And I did, and he put it on the front page. And after that, many difficulties developed. The right wing in Japan was very anxious about this, and they started protesting. And then the Kyoto police called us, and they insisted on meeting us. And I said, I'm too busy to meet you. And they said, you better meet. And they showed up unannounced at our house in Kyoto. And they said, we're worried something may happen to you. I said, well, what have you got in mind? They said, well, you know about how the Japan Airlines plane crashed in Israeli airport, or another one crashed en route to India. We're worried. We better give you our phone number. I said, with what you've got in mind, I don't think your phone number is going to do me any good. And they were trying to intimidate us. And when the North Koreans heard about this, they were furious. They said, there's absolutely no reason for you to need police protection. Don't worry about it, but don't let your children go out and play, they said. Keep your children in the house, they might be kidnapped. But there's nothing to worry about, not at all. Well, that didn't enhance our sense of personal security. And what we did, of course, the Japanese police said we should leave Osaka airport for Hong Kong and then Beijing and then Korea using Japanese names. I think we used the name Nakamura. And it was a very tense time. And we didn't realize, we got to the airport, there were cops all over the airport. They thought there might be some incident. And then we started to go through the inspection for exit from Japan. And all of a sudden, our son Peter is going through. Peter is on the line here today. And the alarm goes off and everybody got very tense. They thought something's happening. And Peter, without telling us, had bought a souvenir sword at take home from Japan. He'd been to school for a year like his brothers in Japan. And that proved to be a rather amusing shattering of what had been a tense experience. My real reason for wanting to go to North Korea, other than the fact of intrinsic interest and maybe the excitement of being the first Americans to go, actually we ended up being the third because two journalists, Harrison Salisbury of the New York Times and Selig Harrison of the Washington Post, preceded us. But my real motive for going to North Korea is I wanted our kids to see China. Joan and I had just had a month in China, May, June of 72, but they didn't invite our children. And when I met Zhou Enlai, he said, why didn't your wife stay to meet me? And I said she was worried about our three kids being left in Kyoto. He said, I forgot. He said, Americans still have to look after children, don't they? Because Chinese cadre at that point put their kids in boarding school and didn't have to worry about them. Well, I wanted the kids to see China. I couldn't get them invited, but I knew that if we got invited to North Korea, including the children, we had to get there. And there were only two ways to get there then from Japan. Either you flew in from Beijing or you flew in from Moscow. And by choosing to fly in from Beijing, it meant we could go in from Hong Kong. We could take a week to go from Hong Kong to Beijing and get our visas in Beijing and go to North Korea. And then we get another week coming back. And we did that. And I think it was a great experience for all of us. Well, I'll talk about our 2 weeks in North Korea later if there's time, but I do want to say something about South Korea. When we went to North Korea, there was big news in South Korea, and willy-nilly we became celebrities, and they insisted that we visit. And I said, I'm teaching until December, but I could come out during the January intersemester period. And Joan and I went out there in January 73. And they really did treat us in an unusual fashion. They opened up the art museum that was closed on Monday so that Joan especially could have a tour. They put on a special sort of tourist trip for us with a very beautiful Korean woman as our escort down to Gyeongju. There was a lot of publicity. This was a big breakthrough because North Korea and South Korea had just begun to have sort of North-South relations in the summer of 72 that we had been there. Talking about adventures in South Korea, they really began shortly thereafter. I had become a friend of Kim Dae-jung. He was the Democratic candidate for presidency in 1971 against the military dictator Park. And it was not a fair election. They almost tried to kill him there in an automobile accident. He survived. He had come to the United States during the campaign in order to show American support. And he wanted to be shown to have given a speech at Harvard, and I arranged for him to give a speech at the law school. He was a great speaker. Kim Dae-jung was a true believer in Jeffersonian democracy. He was also an ardent Catholic, and he believed that the tree of liberty did need to be nourished by the blood of patriots from time to time, and he wasn't afraid. And he gave a great speech, but he wanted to meet Ted Kennedy because he needed support in the election. And I arranged to go down to Washington with him to meet Ted Kennedy. I'd been advising Kennedy since 1966 on China matters. We got to Ted's office. Ted was called suddenly before we got there for a vote on the floor. He came back in, he was very busy. He had a pile of mail on his desk. He didn't really know why I had asked this guy from Korea to meet him. And I was very embarrassed because Ted was not being very polite. And he started opening his mail while I started introducing Kim Dae-jung. But Kim Dae-jung was a person of some ability. And he saw what was going on and he said, Senator, in a way that commanded attention, he said, I want you to know I'm running for the presidency of Korea. And in Korea, I'm known as the Kennedy of Korea. And that got Ted's attention. And he laughed and stopped looking at the mail. And he said, well, we can't see a Kennedy lose an election, he said. And from then on, they became friends. And even in the years when I didn't have time to keep up with Kennedy while I was in China in the 80s, Kim Dae-jung and Kennedy's staff did continue. In the summer of 73, I was in my office at the Harvard Law School, and I got a phone call about 1 o'clock from Kim Dae-jung's assistant, Mr. Lee Kun-pal in Washington. And he told me the alarming news that Kim Dae-jung had just been kidnapped from his hotel in Tokyo, and that he had been spirited away by the Korean CIA operating in Japan. And he said, they're going to kill him. Please call Mr. Kissinger, who was the national security advisor for Nixon. I called Henry's office right away. He was out to lunch, and I talked to his assistant who said he'd given the message. Then I took the kids and Joan from Cambridge to Cape Cod, and I got to Cape Cod. It was already almost 5 o'clock, and then the White House called, And it was Kissinger, and I told him what was going on. He said he hadn't heard the news until I called, and he said, I'll do everything I can to save him. Unbeknownst to me, Lee Kun-pal had also contacted Ed Reischauer, my colleague at Harvard, who knew so much about Japan. And Ed must have put in a call also. Well, we didn't know what would happen. And what happened was the kidnappers took Kim Dae-jung from Tokyo to Kobe, put him on a boat, went into what is called the Sea of Japan, or the Koreans call the Eastern Sea. And they were going to drown Kim Dae-jung. And later he told me, and he's published this in the Donga Ilbao newspaper in Seoul, they took him out of his cabin, they put chains on him and put a blindfold on him and took him on deck. Being a Catholic, he said, gave himself the last rites, and they were just going to throw him over when there was a helicopter overhead and a lot of noise and excitement. And then somebody said, take the chains off him and put him back. And a message had obviously been delivered. Do not carry out the plan to execute Kim Dae-jung. And then they dumped him on a road outside of Seoul eventually. And he lived to tell that tale, but later was put in prison and he was under house arrest for a long time. Well, I continued to go to North Korea, to South Korea, despite that. And in 1974, dictator Park, feeling under greater pressure than ever, enacted 4 emergency decrees. And the 4th one was quite marvelous, because it said that university students who failed to go to class without plausible excuse were subject to the death penalty, because especially Seoul National University students had been rioting against the great dictatorship. And this was an attempt finally to subdue them. And later, when I heard this, I went in to talk to Harvard Law School Dean Erwin Griswold, and I criticized him. I knew he was worried about students at Harvard cutting class. And I said he didn't show enough imagination in trying to get the death penalty to coerce them to attend. He didn't think that was very funny. In any event, I was in South Korea at the time this was going on. And another future president of South Korea, who was a human rights activist under great government dictatorship pressure, was Kim Young-sam. Kim Young-sam was very different from Kim Dae-jung. He did not grow up in the provinces. He was not very religious. He was better educated. He came from a bourgeois, not a proletarian family. And he always wanted to maintain democratic leadership, but stay out of prison. Not an easy act in the Korea of those days. And he was head of the Democrats in the Korean Assembly. And he asked me to give a lecture to try to encourage the Democrats and tell them America was on their side and would be hoping democracy would come to South Korea. But the problem was, what could I say under emergency decree number 4? You weren't allowed to say anything. Then I got the idea I wouldn't talk about South Korea at all. I would only talk about North Korea. So I gave a talk entitled Why We Were All Against North Korea. And then I ticked off all the reasons we were against North Korea. They had no freedom of the press. They had no independent courts. They engaged in arbitrary, cruel detention, etc. And by the time I got to the 4th or 5th characteristics, these legislators were laughing so hard they were crying, because they got the point, and I managed to stay out of jail. Although there was a point when the Korean CIA was under instructions to detain me. At that point, I was sheltering in the Catholic Cathedral, Myeongdong cathedral in Seoul because the KCIA did at least temporarily respect that. And then I made my way to the airport, and I was told on my next trip that only a dispute between the KCIA and another government agency prevented them from acting to detain me. Well, South Korea was a very exciting place, and I was involved. I used to visit Kim Dae-jung when he was under house arrest because it wasn't too strict, because again, they were under American government pressure. And while Kim couldn't go out, he could have an occasional visitor, but they were tapping, of course, the phone. The room was bugged where we met. And so we sat there, he'd been improving his English, and we didn't speak. We sat side by side using one of these children's pads that you can write on, and then you lift up the page and the writing disappears. And we communicated that way. I remember a whole afternoon. I was quite impressed with Kim's English. Well, I could go on about scrapes with South Korea, but I see we're running out of time. And I've got a lot to say about China, but let me try to be brief about that. I spent most of my time with China, not only representing companies in dispute resolution and negotiating contracts, but also trying to improve the legal system, giving lectures all over. For 2 years, I trained before law schools were really resumed after the Cultural Revolution, 79 to 81. I trained Beijing, I almost said university, but Beijing city government economic officials. And the city government asked me to do that. And we gave them 9 hours a week of lectures. Steve Orleans joined me and Owen Nee. We were all working for Couder Brothers, but we persuaded Couder to let us establish legal teaching for Beijing officials if the Beijing government agreed to let us set up shop before other law firms or anybody could set up shop in Beijing. And we did do that. But increasingly, my concern was over arbitrary detention of people, legal profession not really developing as quickly as it might have, restrictions on lawyers. And the 80s were a good time until June 4th, 89. But at that point, I decided that I had to spend more time on human rights matters, and I attacked the government there for the terrible slaughter of June 4th and the terrible years after that of suppression of freedoms and sending so many people to a cruel fate. And it was an exciting time, February 92, 2.5 years later, for the first time since June 4th, the Foreign Correspondents Club asked me to give their first talk. I had to talk about what the impact of June 4th was. And we weren't sure we'd even be allowed to hold the lunch program until the very last minute because the public security had closed down previous attempts at FCC discussions, but we did have that. And I called for China's entry into the WTO, which is still very controversial today. But I also said that the courts had become an instrument of suppression. And the Voice of America picked that up. It was broadcast in the China Prime Minister Li Peng, who had presided over June 4th, heard it. He loved what I said about WTO entry, but he didn't like what I said about the courts had become an instrument of suppression. And 2 days later, as I was leaving my hotel to embark on a tour of law schools of China to see what impact June 4th had on them, I was confronted in the lobby by the deans of the 5 major law schools in Beijing, who just a few days earlier had given a party in my honor, hoping I would tell the Ford Foundation to give them more money despite June 4th. But this time they were there to register a solemn protest. How could I, a supposed friend of China, say that the courts in China were an instrument of suppression? And I said, I hadn't done anything except repeat what the Chief Justice of China, Mr. Ren Zhenxing, had just said. And he was then also the head of the Party National Political Legal Commission. He was Mr. Chinese Law. And he said, we have to use the courts to suppress every counter-revolutionary. And the dean said, oh, that's different. He's talking about suppressing counter-revolutionaries. We're talking about freedom for the people. And counter-revolutionaries, by definition, are not among the people. Well, that today is still something. They don't use the term counter-revolutionary anymore, but it's something to remember. I think that, I see I've overlooked one of the most interesting attempts was in the 70s to meet the Chinese leadership. I managed to have a 4-hour dinner with Zhou Enlai in 72. And in 77, in December, having taken the Kennedy family, 11 of them, to China, Ted wanted to meet Deng Xiaoping. It was clear Deng was coming back after the Cultural Revolution and would be the leading figure in China. And Ted said to me, if I don't meet Deng, I'm going to regard this trip as a failure. And he looked me in the eye and I knew what he meant. And he would hold me responsible because I was along as the so-called China advisor. And then I had to use the techniques I'd learned in China. One was, your room is bugged. So you want to use conversations in the room in a way that will stimulate them to consider something you want done.
And over the phone.
Yes, and Jones reminded me, she's listening. That was the next thing. You also wanted to use telephone conversations. And this was something of a sore point because Joan was at home at Christmas time with our children, and I was out there in Beijing, and I would be calling her every night, talking very loud and clear about my disappointment at the reluctance of the Chinese hosts to arrange a meeting with Deng Xiaoping. And then the Boston Globe reported that I was dancing with Caroline Kennedy one night, and that got me in the doghouse. And all of these efforts, however, worked. And at the last minute, we did get to have a couple of hour session with Deng Xiaoping. That was, to say the least, very, very interesting. But my main interest in China has been getting people out of jail. As some of the classmates here I can see know that our classmate at Yale, class of 51 in the college, Jack Downey, had become a CIA agent. He'd been shot down over China. He was held in Chinese prison. And my class at our 15th reunion, I'd never been to a reunion before. I didn't want to go, but my friend Tony Schulte said I had to. They gave me the task of getting Jack out of jail. And how to do that was my first experience trying to mobilize various pressures. And we did get Jack out of jail, not in 1966, but on March 12th, 1973. After I had to go public by revealing the US government had been lying about the case for 20 years, claiming Jack wasn't a CIA agent. And before the Fulbright Committee, June 71, I spilled the beans. And I could still see Senator Fulbright leaning down and saying, do you mean our government has been lying about this case for 20 years? And I published an op-ed in the New York Times a few days later. We had just had our 20th reunion. It was 1971. And the heading on the op-ed was, will Jack make his 25th reunion? And fortunately, he did. But after that, I spent a lot of time, as some of you know, trying to get Chinese out of jail, and occasionally foreigners out of jail in the 80s and the 90s and more recent I often failed. But there were some times when circumstances made it possible. The most optimal time was when China wanted to get into the WTO, and they said that they would let they would come into the WTO, but they would need congressional approval. Every year until then, China had been waiting for the US Congress to approve China's access to the American market, and they needed US congressional approval to get in the WTO. And they made the mistake of locking up the Dickinson College Chinese librarian, Song Yong-yi, and his wife in Dickinson College came to me and said, "Can you help get this fellow out of jail?" And Arlen Specter had gone to law school with me. Some of people, Bill Felster and others have known about that. And I enlisted Arlen, who was senator from Pennsylvania. This fellow was the librarian of Chinese studies at Dickinson in Pennsylvania. And Arlen and I worked together in a couple TV programs, et cetera, that enabled me to say every night over the phone to the lawyer I retained in China for Song Yong-yi that I wanted China very much to get into the WTO, but Senator Specter told me today that unless they freed his constituent, China would never get congressional approval. And that resulted in the release after 6 months of Song Yong-yi before even indictment. In one or two other cases that I don't have time to discuss, I was able to get people out after conviction and after sentencing, so China could say it vindicated its judicial system. But then there was a deal between the US and China that I had helped arrange to let the person go. One case, it was a mistake. I worked very hard. We mobilized hundreds of signatures on behalf of the detained person, and we didn't realize she really was a triple agent working for the Kuomintang in Taiwan as a spy in China. At the same time, she was a sociologist studying what China was doing, and at the same time was illegally selling air equipment to China, violating our Trading with the Enemy Act, Ms. Gao Zhan. Well, there are a lot of these cases I can't go on about. I just want to say one more story, and then we should have 15 minutes for discussion, and maybe I can cover some other ground. I like to consider some of the amusing aspects of this experience. Beginning 1984, I think, I became the head of the new New York Beijing Sister City Committee. And we had a number of very good activities. And Joan put on an art exhibition, and I had some economic cooperation going. And it was an interesting experience. But when June 4th came, that was a crisis. Now, before that, Mayor Ed Koch, who was quite a character, as some of you know, he was enamored of everything Chinese. He loved Chinese food, and he particularly loved Chinese pandas. And it was his ambition to get our committee to agree with the Chinese to import 2 pandas for the Bronx Zoo. And the Chinese would explain to Mayor Koch every time a delegation came through, you just can't do that. We only have a few pandas. We only have enough to give 2 pandas to each national capital. We've already given Washington 2 pandas. So we're sorry, we can't give you pandas. Well, then we tried to buy 2 pandas. And they said, no, pandas are not for sale. They're precious Chinese. But I knew Chinese government really needed foreign exchange. And I thought, how am I going to solve this? Because Ed Koch was not happy. Chinese would give him panda t-shirts. They would give him panda dolls, but nothing made him happy except the real thing. And I got the idea, if they won't give us a panda, if they won't sell us a panda, how about renting a panda? And sure enough, we got them interested in the idea of leasing 2 giant pandas for 6 months for the Bronx Zoo. But the Chinese kept saying, this is not a commercial proposition. This is friendship. And if we make available for 6 months these 2 pandas, we're doing it in the name of friendship. And I said, of course I know that, but I knew they wanted foreign exchange. And then they said, well, how much of a contribution would you make to the Chinese Wildlife Association in the name of friendship? And I said, we'd be willing to donate as much as $250,000. And they looked bleak and they said, that doesn't sound very friendly. Well, that initiated a real, supposedly non-commercial negotiation. And we ended up, I think we agreed to pay them $1 million for the 6 months. And it was a win-win proposition because they were happy with the foreign exchange. And so many people came to the Bronx Zoo that the zoo made money, even taking account of the $1 million. And Ed Koch was very happy, as I said, until June 4th. When June 4th occurred, without asking me, Ed Koch sent an angry telegram to the Chinese Consul General in New York. And he said, we are severing relations. Our committee is over with the city of Beijing. Well, I wish he had consulted me, although I was happy, but he did it. And a month later, we get a letter back from the Consul General. Dear Mr. Mayor, you don't understand the facts. The reports in the American press are not true, et cetera, et cetera. And again, without asking me, Ed sent another telegram. He said, Mr. Consul General, my advice to you is resign from office and tell the truth. He said, it'll make you feel good. Well, I've gone on a long time here, longer than I intended. I haven't covered some of the subject matter, but I think you get the point. And we have 15 minutes. I'd welcome conversation, criticisms, questions, comments, or whatever.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Professor Cohen. So we do have 15 minutes. If you would like to make a comment or question, if you could first just put something in the chat box and I'll call on you as the order merits, and we'll take it from there. All right, Brian, go ahead. And if you could identify yourself, Brian, this is a diverse audience, so if you could just identify who you are and that would be great.
Sure. I'm Brian Vivier. I'm the Chinese Studies librarian here at Penn. And I want to thank you very much for the talk. It has just been thrilling throughout. I really have a comment, not a question, but I really appreciated the role that your family has played in your peregrinations and the various things you've done. And I love the way that's centered. I've been actually watching this with my partner, and we really appreciated the sense that one doesn't do these things as kind of a solo effort, that one's family is a big part of what one does. And someday I would really like to actually hear what Joan made of Taiwan and her response to the scene, you know, in the White Terror and in the 60s. That was really quite moving. But thank you very much.
You would like to know what Joan has thought of Taiwan since our return, when she waited 25 years for the outcome. Do you want to say anything about this in terms of your
I do not want to put her on the spot.
Taiwan and the art scene?
Oh, no, sure. What would you like to know?
Well, I guess, you know, in part, I was actually interested in your experience of the decision not to go back. That sense, the sense that the unfreedom of Taiwan was really such an imposition. It is also exciting to know what you thought of having gone back since then.
Oh, well, of course. I mean, we had friends from Taiwan, and I knew that there were many people in Taiwan who demanded a freedom of speech and other freedoms that we also enjoy in our country most of the time. And I wanted to make it as easy for our friends who wanted to return to Taiwan as possible. I mean, it's a great country that has struggled for all the reasons we know.
You might want to say something about their art scene and how well it's developed.
Oh, well, the art scene is, of course, blooming. And it has been ever since it's been in its current form. There are so many talented people there, and they have wonderful museums in, of course, main city, Taipei, the capital city, and they're the cultural scene in Taiwan is very lively, and the museums are wonderful, not just in the capital, but in many other cities. And they fully appreciate the heritage of the Taiwan people, and they honor those overseas elements that have developed into the culture, been bred into it, essentially, especially from the neighboring countries and islands around, not just, of course, Western culture, which they also have enjoyed and taken part in, and compete internationally very successfully.
Good. That reminds me, the one story I really wanted to tell, I alluded to earlier, but we didn't get there, was about the killing, October 15th, 84, of the so-called Jiangnan, which was his pen name for Henry Liu. And that was a great story because it not only presented the challenge of getting a recovery from the government that had really assassinated him for wrongful death. His widow desperately needed money. But I had one of my best former students named Annette Liu, Liu Sholian, who later became vice president. But she had been locked up at that point for 5 years after the so-called December 10th, 1979 Kaohsiung incident, as one of the Taiwan independence people, not yet called the Democratic Progressive Party. And she got a 12-year sentence, and I wanted to get her out. And it wasn't proving possible until Henry Liu's assassination. And then it made the Kuomintang smell so bad that I was able to go to Taiwan, and I talked to her classmate at Harvard Law School with whom she had never gotten along, Ma Ying-jeou. He was then Deputy Secretary General of the KMT. And I said to him that they ought to work hard to rehabilitate their government's reputation. And the first step they could take would be to release Annette Liu. And inside of a matter of weeks, because Ma, at my suggestion, did go to President Chiang Ching-kuo, they did release Annette Liu on the understanding she would go to Harvard for another year. We used the Harvard University campus as a place for the rehabilitation of political offenders in Asia, in the Philippines, Korea, Taiwan, etc. And what was exciting about that case was the US government pressed the Taiwan government to prosecute the murderers. And the real responsible people were in the military, Ministry of National Defense Intelligence Bureau. They were not subject to civil justice, but to court-martial. And the three of them were prosecuted in court-martial. I couldn't take part in the trial, but I could go attend the court-martial. I think it was the first public court-martial that Taiwan had ever had. And I was fascinated, as the audience was, with the defense of Admiral Wang, who was in charge of the killing. He'd been Chiang Kai-shek's aide de camp. He was very close to the Chiang family. And his defense to the charge of murder was, and I heard him say this, he said, "You know, Your Honors, we didn't do this thing. If we had done this killing, you'd never know about it. We're professionals," he said. 10 or 20 years ago, we used to kill people all the time and nobody knew about it. So this is not our crime. And the audience just hushed when they heard that. But the civilians, the 3 members of the Bamboo Union gang who'd done the actual shooting, and they were put on civilian trial. And I wanted to get evidence that we could use against the Taiwan government so we could bring a prosecution, a lawsuit against them, a civil suit for wrongful death in San Francisco federal court. We had no evidence. And the problem was how to get it. Well, in Taiwan, as in many civil law countries, if there's a criminal prosecution, a civil suit that arises out of the same facts can be joined so that they both are tried together. And we brought a civil suit against the gang members in Taiwan. The trial court refused to let us in on a spurious technicality. That created a lot of foreign criticism. And on appeal, I was allowed in as the representative of the widow. I had to get a lawyer, and nobody would take on it was a horrendously tense time. But I did find an ambitious city councilman named Xie Changting, Frank Xie, who saw this as an opportunity, and he became our lawyer in the civil suit, and he and I were able to intervene in the criminal case. And that gave me a chance in court to interrogate the killers. And Admiral Wang had to appear, even though he was a military person, and I cross-examined him. And of course, he lied through his teeth. He didn't remember this, he didn't remember that. He didn't remember putting the Bamboo Union gang up to the killing. But the most interesting thing we brought out was Admiral Wang had mentioned, had met the head of the Bamboo Union gang through a dinner party that was given by a famous movie director. He was sort of the Alfred Hitchcock of Taiwan, a man named Bai Jingray. And it was at a lunch he gave at a housewarming for his new apartment that the head of the Bamboo Union gang and Admiral Wang met each other. And there was another guest at that party, the brother of President Jiang Weiguo, who was then number 3 at the Ministry of National Defense. And he was invited to the lunch. And when Admiral Wang and Jiang Weiguo sat next to each other, the head of the Bamboo Union gang could see how close Admiral Wang was to the brother of the president. And the next week, when Admiral Wang took the head of the gang to dinner alone and they conspired to kill Henry Liu, it didn't take much for the head of the gang to believe this was a patriotic act. This was in defense of the president of Taiwan against somebody who they claimed was defaming him. And this Bai Jingray, whether he knew or not, and whether Jiang Weiguo knew or not what the purpose of the lunch had been, we don't know. But we brought out in court that Jiang Weiguo was at this lunch, and he denied he knew anything. And the movie director often invited beautiful starlets to join events like that to provide a good ambiance. And Jiang Weiguo was known as a ladies' man. And when he was asked, "Why were you there?" he said, "Well, I thought it was a social occasion." And we never did find out whether he knew what was really afoot at that. But that was a fascinating exercise. In the end, Admiral Wang was convicted and sentenced to life by the court martial, and the head of the Bamboo Union gang was himself convicted and sentenced to life. but we all knew they would be treated very well in prison, and that on every holiday and other occasion, their sentence would be reduced, and eventually they would be relatively soon released. So that was a very exciting occasion, and I did feel that was the only time I've ever had an adventure in the sense of having my life subject to possible harm. And that's why I again stayed at Madame John's Grand Hotel, but you never knew every time you opened the door would there be somebody to throw acid in your face. And it was highly publicized and very exciting.
Thank you. It looks like we are getting toward time, but I do want, we have an accumulation of questions, but at least let's go to one more. Nason, do you mind introducing yourself and ask your question?
Sure. Hi, Jerry. You know me, but I'll introduce myself to the others. Nason Mahboubi from the Center for the Study of Contemporary China here at Penn, where I'm actually at. So this is where I am. Jerry, great to see you. Thanks for your terrific narrative. I think many of us hear often and even say that the current moment is the most fraught moment in U.S.-China relations throughout the last 40 years since the normalization of relations. And when I say that as someone who only started paying attention in 1990 when I was in junior high school. So I don't really know if that's a true statement. From your perspective, is that a true statement, that this is the worst time for U.S.-China relations since the normalization of relations, or even sometime before that, as long as you've been paying attention?
Certainly, I think that's true. We're on a potentially very dangerous course. We hope the new administration of Biden will be able to present a more balanced China policy. I reduced to a simplified, essentializing formula what we ought to be doing. I call it the 4 C's, capital C. And one is we must try to cooperate with China with respect to the critical questions, and climate is the obvious one, but there are many others we could tick off, including economic questions. Obviously, we'll compete with China, that's the 2nd C, in business, economics, and soft power quest, etc. The 3rd C is criticism. I believe in criticism, maybe more sincerely than the Chinese communists, who used to boast about the use of criticism and self-criticism. The other day, the leading spokesman in Hong Kong for the pro-government position on law, Grenville Cross, former prosecutor, he really lit into the US criticism of China in Hong Kong as hypocrisy because of the many human rights problems we have yet to solve in our own country. But of course, he said nothing about the human rights problems in China or in Hong Kong now. But I believe mutual criticism is the 3rd C. We benefit from honest, fact-based criticism of China and others. We can't compare our legal theory with their facts, their reality. We have to compare apples and apples and benefit. I'm not equating the two. Their deprivation of human rights in so many respects we're familiar with are far greater, I feel, than even ours. But I think it's useful. The final C, the 4th C, is containment. I think we have to do more as we seem to be now gradually moving to resurrect our alliances and to really contain the worst aspects of Chinese military power. But at the same time, we have to contain our own military power, which has run amok, as we've seen in Central Asia, Middle East, etc. So I think what we need is balance. What we've had in recent months under Trump, perhaps in an attempt to win the election, is all out, all of government, one-sided, unilateral attacks on China. And that's a very dangerous thing to do. I think China is worried about it. They haven't been immoderate in some respects lately, and they could have been. It's true they've stirred up things in India, but in many other respects, it's been relatively quiet on very controversial questions. They're worried, and they should be worried. But Hong Kong is the big example. But they didn't do what they're doing in Hong Kong to worsen relations with the US. They're doing it because the situation in Hong Kong was getting out of their control. And they felt they had to act in a highly high-handed dictatorial manner in order to suppress the rising protests in China that the local government couldn't handle. And so what we've seen is an attack on Hong Kong that wasn't intended to worsen US-China relations, but has done a huge amount, more than Xinjiang, more than Tibet, etc., to make things more dangerous between us. And of course, it stirred up the rest of the liberal democratic world also. So we're in a very, as you say, fraught situation.
Thanks, Jerry. If you wouldn't mind, we have one more who has been waiting for a while. Tamia, do you want to give your question?
I love it.
Oh, awesome. Okay, hi, I'm Tamia, and I'm a sophomore from the college at Penn, and I'm majoring in Chinese and Japanese. So I want to thank you so much for all your contributions, and it's been really thrilling and informative. So my question, I feel like, is kind of more a pedagogical question, but I've been realizing that throughout your whole experience, it seemed like when you were acting as a representative in maybe like contract negotiations or other situations, you or a lot of people were listening into what you were saying. Did you find yourself having to monitor your speech, especially like in the classroom? I remember you said you went to Japan and you were invited as a visiting speaker or professor for a year.
Well, in Japan, because the university was closed down for much of a year, I was in the ideal position of being a visiting professor who could not profess. So I didn't have to confront that. But of course, I've confronted that in lecturing in China, in lecturing in Hong Kong, Taiwan, United States, Europe. The great thing about being a tenured American professor is you can say what you think. That's why I became a professor. I admired my Yale Law School teachers, didn't always agree with all of them, but they were free to say what they wanted to say. And unless you have unlimited income of a personal nature, you don't have too many jobs that can allow you to say what you think. So I've always decided to say what I think. And the only time you could say I might have eased up a bit was when I was in law practice and Tiananmen occurred June 4th. And I had to think every time I spoke out, it was going to be harmful to my law firm and to the 20-odd young lawyers who were working with me, as well as to our clients. And that's why I finally decided that 20 years ago, I would go back to academic life. I could have stayed on in practice of law, either with my current firm or with a new firm, even though I would have been a retired partner. But I wanted to be free. And it's difficult for lawyers to be free if they have to worry about their clients and they have to worry about their colleagues. But yet many are free. And in China, I especially admire the human rights lawyers, many of whom are suffering. As they say, some of my best friends in China are in prison at the moment. And lawyers are, the Hong Kong bar is a good example. Right now, the only defense against the takeover that the handover has become is the Hong Kong Bar Association and the stimulus that they continue to give to the Hong Kong courts that are under fierce attack. Hong Kong's vaunted independent judiciary is being attacked every day by the communist regime in Beijing and their lackeys in the local government.
Thank you so much, Professor Cohen. I know that we could probably spend another hour or two or three or five tapping more of your fantastic stories, but I do want to give you a break. And I do want to thank you so much for finally sort of joining us for our distinguished lecture this year and giving us not only a vision of your impeccable, incredible scholarship, but life of activism and above all, certainly adventure. As a modern Japan historian, I feel, I don't know, I guess I picked the wrong thing to do. My life is quite boring by comparison. But anyway, please everyone join me in thanking Professor Cohen for this wonderful discussion today, and we hope to see you again very soon. Looking forward to the memoir when it comes out.
Thank you, Fred.
Yeah. Thank you.